right, welcome to the Energy Perspectives podcast from Energy Dialogues. We are recording today in San Diego, and I'm joined by David Victor, a professor of innovation and public policy at UCSD, and Martha Crawford, who is a technologist and senior advisor to private equity in energy transition and infrastructure. So thank you both so much for being here. I'm so excited to get to have this conversation with you. And so what I'd love to do is start by giving both of you an opportunity to introduce yourselves and talk about how decarbonization of energy or carbon solutions integrate into the work that you have done and the work that you're doing today. So David, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure, yeah. So I'm an academic. I study deep decarbonization. So how do you make big reductions in emissions, 80%, 100% reductions in emissions? Not shallow decarbonization, do things a little more efficiently, but transformative and disruptive changes. A lot of our research is around electric power grids. It's around integrating renewables and keeping grid reliability. Huge amount of our work now is about electric vehicle charging in particular. Most of the increase in the load in electric power as we move to a low emission future is going to come from vehicles, but when and how people charge those vehicles is going to have a big impact on their overall effect on the grid. So we do a lot of work on that, on the human behavior side.
Absolutely. Martha?
Yes, so I have been working on decarbonization of energy since my 20s, and I guess what drove me is early in my career, I was out in the Marshall Islands for 3 years, actually, and I started working with the Asian Development Bank and got to travel all around Southeast Asia and saw real poverty and became convinced that, in fact, we needed not just to go and tell folks, hey, you shouldn't develop your forests or your, catch your fish, but actually to help find a better way to do economic development, a more sustainable way. And necessarily that means producing less waste and using less energy, but it also fundamentally could mean a transformation of the way we do things. And that's what led me back to graduate school, actually, which I did in Cambridge, and that's how we met a long time ago. Very funny, but I did a PhD in environmental engineering and then an MBA after that, and I have worked in industry, leading research and development at the global level for multinational corporations in industrial gases and in energy, basically trying to help develop completely different ways of doing things. So that has involved work on hydrogen production and utilization as an energy vector. It's involved large-scale demonstration projects on carbon capture and sequestration with power plants, with blast furnaces. It's involved biofuels, electric vehicles, all sorts of technologies. And I had a career mainly in France for 20 years, came back to the United States, and I have gotten involved as a senior advisor with private equity groups now. It's very exciting because, in fact, some of the technologies that I helped to develop in the lab and even at the demonstration level in Europe, we're now trying to commercialize and scale and generalize. And so it's a very exciting time. Also, the fact that I came from Europe where we were a little more advanced because the European Union put so much money on the table for demonstration projects, also gives me some insight, which has been helpful in trying to pick the best companies to buy, because that's what we do in private equity, and try to develop. So that's what I've been focusing on, and it's a very exciting time here in the United States with all the new legislation in favor of infrastructure investment.
Absolutely, and that's actually a really fantastic place to start. I don't think it's possible to talk to anyone in the industry without hearing about what an impact the IRA and this support from policy has made on the ability to get projects rolling. And so I would be curious, David, I've heard you in several places reference these Goldman Sachs numbers, these $4 trillion that need to be invested in clean energy in the next decade. And so we've got the IRA, we're starting to see results from that, and I'd love to hear you talk about that, but what do we need to get from policy that's going to help accelerate that deployment of capital?
Well, I think we have to recognize the government's not going to pay for everything. Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, those are the two major pieces of funding here in the United States. They both put a lot of money on the table, but in terms of the overall spend that's going to be necessary, it's really huge. So the Goldman Sachs numbers give us some sense of the order of magnitude, on the order of $4 trillion per year of investment, which, in a 100 trillion plus global economy is actually doable when you think about it from that point of view. So it's important that we keep perspective. $4 trillion sounds like a huge number. It's a big number, but it's in context of we invest that kind of money on lots of other things that matter to us. Right now, global investment is somewhere north of $1 trillion a year, depending on which data set you look at. I think what we're seeing right now is that investment is beginning to flow, but into places where the risks are at least manageable. It's not the risks are zero, but they're going into solar, they're going into wind, they're going to electric power grids, they're going into a lot of stuff around electric vehicles, vehicle charging systems, batteries, and so on. The Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA has lowered those risks or kept those risks manageable for lots of technologies, including solar and wind and batteries and onshoring and so on. So that's improved the investment picture. But at the end of the day, the most important role for policy here is to help lower risks or make risks more manageable for things that we need to ultimately build, mainly with private capital.
That makes a lot of sense. And I guess what are some of the tools that you see to be able to lower that risk? You know,
Well,
if we're going to put a policy out there, what lowers that risk?
It depends on the sector and depends on the stage of technological development. And I think that's one of the key insights, actually, is that there's a new theory of change in town, as it were, which is we're not going to solve the global climate problem with a global committee that tells everybody what to do. We're going to solve the global climate problem by identifying governments and firms that are highly motivated to do something about the problem, and they go off and invest and create new facts on the ground inside their individual sectors. And so for early stage technologies, some of it's classic government funding, backstop for building, for example, hydrogen infrastructure, a lot of direct support for electrolyzers, and so kind of create new industries that way. As the technologies get more mature, there's a bigger role for government to help either provide capital, like the Loan Programs Office and Department of Energy, that in effect they backstop loans to lower the cost of capital for new projects. And one part of the story, one more thing I'll say here, which is there's a big role for government, both at the federal level and at the state level, and even firms, big firms, on the demand side. We have a tendency to focus a lot on the supply of technologies. How do we fund new things that are going to be out there available for everybody? But it's amazing what happens when you can see reliable demand. When there's a long-term contract to buy something that's clean energy, then lots of suppliers suddenly become viable because they have a way of financing that project against the revenue stream of that long-term contract.
That makes a lot of sense. And that idea of long-term demand, I want to turn it to you, Martha. I know you talked a little bit about sort of this unique perspective you have, that your history as a chief technologist, now, you know, you're being able to fund and scale these projects that the past you helped create, which I think is a very unique perspective and pretty amazing. But when you're looking at your ability to do that, when in your work with these private equity firms, what needs to happen in order to put that capital in the right places? So what needs to change in order to get that capital out onto the streets?
Yeah, so I think what David just said is really important, is that when you look at decarbonizing energy, there are really sort of at least two buckets. Let's just, for the sake of argument, say two buckets, right? So there's one bucket, which is these relatively mature technologies like solar and wind, which have been already scaled. And by the way, historical footnote, they've also been massively subsidized, solar by Germany 30 years ago. So they just...
Well, and another footnote, which is they've been globalized, right? So
yes,
this is a reminder.
absolutely.
I mean, it's the German program and then the Chinese manufacturing scale up and so on. And I think one of the things that the clean energy advocates often forget, especially in this era of onshoring, is that we benefit from responsible globalization, that these technologies, if they can be done at a global scale with access to global markets, that brings down the learning
Right, exactly.
curves.
We can reduce the cost. And so basically that second bucket is technologies that have not yet gone through that process. And so, yes, they're proven. Yes, we have what we call FOACs, first-of-a-kind plants that operate maybe for 200 continuous hours. But then we're coming along and saying, okay, now our plan is we want to create 200 of these, and they have to be 100 times bigger. That's a totally different risk profile. No one's ever done that before. And the issue that we have in private equity is the money that's raised. We talk about OPM, other people's money, and that's what we're investing. It's not our money. We have a fiduciary duty to be extremely, careful. And yes, it's patient capital, but it's not reckless capital. And so we have to find possibilities to invest it that correspond to the risk level. And so the pools of capital that we have, what we call dry powder, And people, are often like, well, why don't you just invest your dry powder? Well, a lot of times it's because it's been raised with a different risk profile. And so we don't really have the right to go and invest in, let's say, large-scale sustainable aviation fuel from biological waste. We don't. It's too high risk. Many situations like that, we just can't do it. So either we need to go back to the source and raise money which has that risk profile and say, look, we're looking to do growth equity. This is not your classical leverage buyout. This is growth equity, which is somewhere between LBO, the leverage buyout, and venture capital in terms of risk. We could do that, or there needs to be a way that it's de-risked by government partners. That's what Europe has been doing, and that's probably why they're way out in front in some cases. But that's the challenge is finding investment opportunities that correspond to the types of risk that we can take with that capital. And one of the things that de-risks is long-term offtake agreements, and that's what we generally look for. I mean, we're ready to say to, let's say, a company that is capturing hydrogen from a waste stream off of a chlor-alkali plant. Okay, you have chlor-alkali plants all around in the United States, and now we're talking about creating hydrogen hubs. One of the ways to produce hydrogen out in the middle of nowhere is to capture these waste streams, and you can provide that to distribution centers for Walmart or for whoever. And so that's a potentially very interesting possibility. But in order for us to take that risk and say, okay, we buy that you can do this, this is all sort of off-the-shelf mature technologies that you're putting together in a new way. So yes, it's a higher risk, but we're ready to take that risk. The only way we can take that risk is if they have long-term offtake agreements. So they have companies who are saying, yeah, we're going to buy everything you can produce for the next 10 years. Then we can take that to the bank. That suddenly becomes something which is bankable. And so it comes back to exactly what David was saying. It's demand. It's creating a market. The market for hydrogen today is nascent. It is starting, and like I said, forklifts and distribution centers, one of the more mature markets. Probably heavy-duty vehicles is one of the more robust emerging markets. But overall, the market's not there yet. And without that demand, there has to be a push to create that demand. Otherwise, it's not financeable.
So a lot of people lining up to finance the other FOAC, the fifth of a kind. The first of a kind is a really different animal here. But I think something Martha said is what Martha said is really important to put the center here. What's happening now is you have all these different new business propositions that are connecting technology and businesses, and therefore investments. And people are hunting for those early adopter niche markets. If it's forklifts in a big box store, if it's Maersk, which wants to buy clean shipping fuels, a lot of interest around a whole range of clean shipping fuels, including notably methanol. And how do you get started with that? And with anything that involves a lot of infrastructure, getting started is really hard because you've got to have all these pieces in place. And so looking for that niche where you don't have to have the entire infrastructure changed, but you can begin disruption there, that's the key.
Yeah.
And I guess I'd be curious, as you talk about this need for demand, as you talk about these different places that it's possible for capital to deploy today, whether it's in connecting technology with infrastructure, whether it's in the very, more conservative, whether it's in venture, where are the places where it's not getting, what's missing right now?
Oh, places.
Market pull. We have technology push, we don't have enough market pull.
Yeah, I think that's right, and you see this in the data. So 85-90% of the total investment in clean energy is around places where it's clear what the market pull is: solar, wind, electric vehicle infrastructure, and vehicles themselves writ large. We can kind of see people selling stuff, and you kind of have a way of thinking about those risks and the capacity to, if not fully de-risk, to manage the risks and figure out ways of allocating those risks. But in places where the market doesn't exist, it's fun to talk about all these different technologies, but you can't really do deals. And the problem is not the shortage of capital in some sense. The world is awash in capital. The problem is this marriage of capital with firms that have the expertise to run projects and not, do stupid stuff basically, and then managing risk in those early markets to turn interesting ideas into things that are really bankable.
Absolutely, and I think, and Martha, this would be an interesting question as well. I know as a part of your background, you've worked in corporate strategy as well in terms of your more academic work. And so I guess I would be curious, when you're looking at these companies and you're looking at these opportunities, how do you grow that corporate culture? How do you grow that governance and that leadership that produces these sorts of companies and produces companies that are able to marry the capital with the risk, with the opportunity?
Yeah. So we look a lot at the management team. Management team is critical. You know, it's funny. I remember when I did my MBA, what they taught us was about leverage buyout is you know, if without a super solid management team, just don't even touch it with a 10-foot pole. Actually, what I see in reality, especially when you start getting into these more emerging, you know, they're smaller companies, is that we're making an arbitrage. We're like, okay, is there half of the management team that can make it? And do we have a bullpen of executives who we're keeping warm, you know, who we could pop in to help us? And the reason is pretty easy to understand when you zoom out and look at it. Essentially, what we're looking at is companies that have come out of what I call the VC funnel, the venture capital funnel. So maybe they're 10 years old, 12 years old. Their existence has depended on them going to market and raising capital, basically selling a dream. And if you've spent time around venture capitalists, in general, they're very good at pitching. They have this hockey stick and everything's going to be happily ever after. And if it doesn't happen, well, guess what? They go back and they raise another round. And that's not the world of private equity. You know, if you say you're going to do something in private equity, you have to deliver. And we need free cash flow because that's how we pay back the debt. And so you have to deliver. So one of the issues is we have a disconnect between the skill sets and the mindsets of the management team that's come out of that, you know, and they've been very successful. But not all of them can adapt to this new world where you just have to execute and deliver. It's not words that's going to solve anything. You actually have to do it. So there's one issue, is that the growing pains, we always face that in private equity. As you double or triple the size, very often you do have to reinforce the management team. So it's not that we're not used to doing some of that, it's that it's in a much shorter period of time. And it's also at a time when the company is very small, so there's already a lot of risk. So you have to assess the key person risk. Is this whole company dependent on one individual who we're not going to be able to work with? So that's a big piece of it. The other piece, like I said, is long-term offtake agreements. You know, is there somebody who wants this product?
Yep.
And then what's the technology risk? And that's where people like me come in who have come from that world. We can help them assess because, you know, they're like, hey, I have an undergrad in engineering, but I'm a banker. So, you know, please help me. And, you know, that's where you can go, okay, yeah, I know this system. I know the kinks, you know, from 10 years ago, the problems that we had were here and here. So then you go and you deep dive on those and you talk with the experts and you go, okay, this is believable. They've solved that problem. Or no, don't worry about this. This is off the shelf. So you have to have also a lot more experts who really know the technology. But there's no cure for the lack of market. And I think that's what's exciting about the present situation in the United States is that the BIL, you know, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Infrastructure Reduction Act, the Inflation Reduction Act.
I think the Infrastructure Reduction Act is actually happening after the election this fall.
It's actually interesting. I mean, it's basically the biggest climate protection package that has ever happened in the United States, and the euphemistic name is the Inflation Reduction Act. Yeah. But I would add to that, the CHIPS Act, I think, was also hugely important because what we're seeing is a threefold transformation. It's meant to catalyze a transformation not only of the energy system and the industry system, but also to digitalize. And I think that's really key, is the AI role in helping. And this is underexploited, and I think that's an area where we probably can deploy more private capital. We're not yet realizing the potential of artificial intelligence for optimizing the functioning of a microgrid, for balancing the energy load within a grid. There's a lot of room to use AI to help accelerate this process of decarbonizing.
Yeah, I think, obviously the CHIPS Act has this challenge that a lot was authorized and not as much appropriated, whereas the others, you know, real money on the table. I think there's a great contest underway right now in corporate governance, which is, will these revolutions come from existing firms that learn how to do new tricks? So think about electric power companies, wires companies that figure out how to bring AI in and so on and not break the grid? Or will it come mostly from small companies that right now are specializing in raising money and stewarding new technologies, and then with some adult supervision turn into bigger companies? And I think we don't know the answer to this. Kasia Janaszek, his partner McKinsey, and I have a piece out in Foreign Affairs late November that makes the argument that we need existing energy companies that are motivated to do something about the energy transition, along with more patient, long-dated capital like pension funds, PE, and so on, because you need the skills from people who know how to run complex systems in order to engage in the kind of transformations needed. Yeah. But it's very, very hard for a company that's optimized. This is Clay Christensen and the Innovator's Dilemma. It's kind of all over again. You have companies that are optimized around doing what they do now, like an oil and gas company. They're optimized to find oil and gas, produce it, market it, and so on. Then you say, well, do that, keep making money, but do something new. And for senior leadership, it's very hard to do both those things, the different risk profiles, different skill sets, and things like that. And that's the kind of clutching and gearing that we see going on inside the corporate world right now.
Absolutely. And so we talk a lot about leadership and we talk about these new opportunities. And I think, in essence, to solve a global scale problem, the big question is, how do we get from the leader? David, you talked about how do you get from leadership? That's important, but followership is what's going to solve for climate. And in this foreign policy piece, you also talk about sort of this is getting from the shiny new thing to the disruption of the system. And so what's it going to take to get some of these nascent opportunities, some of these exciting technologies, some of these exciting financial models? How do you scale those on a global level? Yeah,
so we've seen over the last decade a big shift in the theory of change to a theory that actually works, which is let's not try and solve this global problem by global committee. Let's have these highly motivated firms and governments that are off creating new facts on the ground. They have an interest in advancing those technologies. It spreads out from there. So that disruption's happening. That disruption helps explain why we're starting to see emission curves at least bend down or not rise as rapidly as they have in the past. And so new ideas and technologies are emerging around that. That's the leadership part of this. That has a very, very important role. I'm concerned that and this comes from someone who lives in California, that we tend to be obsessed about leadership and not pay enough attention to followership, which is, this is a global problem, and so if the leaders go off and eliminate their emissions, ironically, they become less directly relevant to the problem because they're not emitting as much. What you need is a leadership that produces new technologies and ideas that then can be adopted, replicated. Replication is really the key to affecting global emissions. And this is why the globalization part of the solar story is so important that we were talking about a little bit ago, because you want these technologies to spread into global markets and application as quickly as possible. If you balkanize those global markets with lots of kind of hodgepodgey, kind of wacky onshoring programs that create risks and chaos in supply chains and so on, you drive up costs, and you also make followership harder.
Absolutely. And so Martha, you've worked in so many different fields and sort of have had a front row to being able to foster some of this collaboration. So in terms of sort of engagement, in terms of dialogue, what role does that play in coming to solution here?
Well, I think, when you talked about leadership and followership earlier, I totally went down a different rabbit hole thinking about, yes, absolutely. It's not enough. I think very often we think being a leader means being right and coming up with the answer. And, that if we get the answer and we go up to a high place and yell it from the rooftop, and then we just solve the problem. And that is not solving any problems. If you want to affect change in the world, you have to remain engaged with people. You have to dialogue with people, and you have to take time to understand their reality. I remember when I was working in France, I had a wonderful boss in one of my first jobs, and when I came in, I was very concerned with getting all these things, all these initiatives launched, and I was really working day and night and launching things. And I remember this conversation we had, one-on-one conversation, and he, like a monthly check-in, and he said, it serves no purpose to be the first locomotive out of the station if you haven't taken the time to attach the wagons. The wagons are the followers. And the wagons, you have to attach them, and you have to go and check that they're attached. So it's better to take a little more time, but make sure that you've engaged people and that you've understood their realities. Because if you're the United States or you're Germany, your reality is very different from India's or China's. So just saying, oh, you should all be like us, is not solving any problems because you haven't taken the time to understand even how to couple them. So I think that's critical to have this kind of dialogue and to spend time together and to remember that we don't know everything. And it's not, the question isn't to be right, the question is to be as right as possible in the real world and to bring people along.
And through dialogue to recognize that sometimes there are other locomotives in the world that are out there chugging along.
You're absolutely right.
We ought to connect to them. Might
Yeah,
be better,
exactly. Yeah, and then we have a saying in France also, le parfait est l'ennemi du bien. Perfect is the enemy of the good. And it's so true.
We have that saying here in America too.
But we say it in French.
Yeah, okay. It sounds much more sophisticated.
Sounded
Well,
I can't think of a better place to end this conversation, this energy dialogue, than talking about the importance of having these conversations and about not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good and finding ways to continue to move forward together. So thank you both so much for your time, and it was a pleasure to speak with you today.
Excellent. Thank you.
Same. Thanks.